When we hear the term serial killer, certain infamous names instantly come to mind: Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy. These individuals have become almost mythic in their notoriety, their horrifying crimes retold in documentaries, podcasts, and endless media coverage. But for every notorious killer etched into the public consciousness, there are many others whose evil slipped through the cracks of history. These are the predators who devastated entire communities, shattered families, and committed crimes so brutal that even seasoned investigators were left shaken, yet their names remain largely unknown. Today, we delve into the chilling depths of these forgotten horrors to uncover 5 of the most terrifying serial killers you've probably never heard of. These aren't merely obscure footnotes in the annals of crime, they are monsters who operated in plain sight, hiding behind ordinary faces, deceiving everyone around them, and evading justice for years. Their crimes, often hidden in the shadows, were as vile and calculated as any of the most well-known murderers. We begin with the Oakland County child killer, a shadowy figure who spread fear across suburban Detroit during the late 1970s. Despite an intense investigation, this phantom predator was never caught and may still be walking free today. Then there's Walter Yellis, a seemingly ordinary man who led a double life in Milwaukee while secretly preying on women for decades. We also examined the case of Jake Bird, a wandering laborer whose killing spree stretched across state lines, baffling authorities with its scope and randomness. From Canada, we uncovered the disturbing story of Clifford Olson, a man who turned the murder of children into a grotesque transaction for personal gain. Finally, there's William Suff, known as the Riverside prostitute killer, who lived a terrifying, dual existence, carrying out brutal killings while holding down a government job, his two lives colliding in the most horrifying way imaginable. What makes these stories particularly terrifying isn't just the body counts or the sheer brutality involved, but how these individuals managed to remain invisible for so long. They blended seamlessly into their communities, portraying themselves as normal, even respectable people, while secretly committing acts of pure evil. Some of them are still alive, serving life sentences behind bars, taking their secrets with them to the grave. Others may have escaped justice altogether, their identities never revealed, their true number of victims lost to time. But make no mistake, their crimes left scars that still haunt families and communities to this day. Before we proceed, it's important to issue a warning. The stories you're about to hear are not just grim, they are profoundly disturbing. These are not cases of random violence or crimes of opportunity. We're talking about targeted cruelty, often inflicted on children, and acts so inhumane they challenge everything we think we know about the human capacity for evil. If you're not prepared to confront this level of darkness, now might be the time to click away. But if you're still with us, understand that these stories must be told not for shock value, not for entertainment, but because remembering the victims is the only way to ensure their killers don't win again through silence and forgetting. Let's begin with the case that exemplifies just how terrifying an uncaught killer can be. In the winter of 1976, the quiet and affluent suburbs of Oakland County, Michigan, were turned upside down by a series of child abductions and murders that defied logic and precedent. This wasn't the work of an obvious deviant or a passing drifter. This was someone with a chilling familiarity with children, someone capable of gaining their trust with ease, someone who planned each move with unnerving precision. The nightmare began on February 15, 1976, when 12-year-old Mark Stebbins vanished while walking home from a pool hall in Ferndale. Mark was responsible and well-behaved, the kind of kid who never strayed far from home and always checked in if he'd be late. When he failed to return for dinner, his family immediately sensed something was wrong. For days later, Mark's lifeless body was discovered in a snowbank in Southfield. He was fully clothed, his appearance almost neat. There were no signs of sexual assault, but he had been strangled. What alarmed investigators the most wasn't just the fact that he had been murdered, it was the eerie care that had been taken with his body. His clothes had been washed and pressed, His hair had been shampooed and carefully combed, and someone had fed him his favorite food, Kentucky Fried Chicken, shortly before he was killed. This wasn't the result of a spontaneous attack. It was calculated, organized, and deeply disturbing. The horror didn't end there. Just months later, on December 22, 1976, 10-year-old Jill Robinson disappeared following an argument with her mother. She left the house on her bicycle, intending to ride a few miles to her father's home, but she never made it. 12 days later, her body was found near Interstate 75. Like Mark, she was fully clothed, and the disturbing pattern began to emerge. Yet answers remained elusive, and the killer seemed to vanish into the shadows, waiting to strike again. The killer's disturbing pattern continued with chilling precision. Jill Robinson's body, like Mark's, was handled with an eerie level of care. Even her bicycle was found nearby, propped up perfectly as if it had been gently parked rather than discarded. Then came Christine Mihalik. The 10-year-old disappeared on January 2, 1977, while walking to a 7-Eleven just blocks from her home in Berkeley. 19 days later, her body was discovered in a snowbank in Franklin Village. The same haunting signature was present. Her clothing was clean, her body carefully positioned with almost ritualistic attention to detail. At this point, Oakland County was gripped by fear. Parents refused to let their children play outside, schools implemented emergency safety measures, and local news stations gave the unidentified killer a name: the Oakland County Child Killer. The sense of terror spread like wildfire, consuming every corner of the community. But the nightmare wasn't over. On March 16, 1977, 11-year-old Timothy King asked his mother if he could walk to a nearby pharmacy to buy some candy. The store was less than 6 blocks away from their home in Birmingham. His mother agreed, asking him to return within half an hour. Timothy never came back. 6 days later, his body was found in a shallow ditch in Livonia, just 20 miles from where he had disappeared. Like the previous victims, he had been bathed, dressed, and carefully arranged. But this time, there was a disturbing new detail. Timothy showed no signs of decomposition, despite having been missing for nearly a week. Investigators concluded that he had been kept alive for days, fed, cared for, and then murdered just hours before his body was discovered. An autopsy revealed a gut-wrenching clue. His stomach contained Kentucky Fried Chicken, the same meal fed to Mark Stebbins before his death. In response, law enforcement launched one of the largest investigations in Michigan's history. A dedicated task force was formed, working around the clock. They chased down thousands of leads, interviewed hundreds of people, and poured millions of dollars into the case. Composite sketches were drawn, witness testimonies compiled, and forensic evidence analyzed. They knew one thing for certain: they were dealing with someone who knew the local area intimately, someone who could blend into the suburbs without raising suspicion, someone possibly living among them. And yet, no matter how close investigators seemed to get, the killer was always a step ahead. After Timothy King's death, the murders abruptly stopped. No more victims, no more clues. Just a haunting silence that stretched for decades. It was as though the killer had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only grief, questions, and for lifeless children. Over the years, many suspects have come and gone. Christopher Bush, a convicted pedophile, was found dead in 1978 from an apparent suicide, surrounded by disturbing evidence, but never officially tied to the case. Arch Sloan, another known predator, once claimed to have knowledge of the crimes, but nothing could be confirmed. Even a wealthy businessman named Francis Sheldon, who operated a suspected child abuse ring on a private island, was investigated. Yet none of these leads ever resulted in a conclusive breakthrough. No suspect could be definitively connected to all 4 murders, and the case remains open to this day. In recent years, cold case investigators have re-examined the evidence using modern forensic technology. New DNA samples have been tested, long silent witnesses have been re-interviewed, and experts have pored over every piece of the decades-old puzzle. But the Oakland County child killer remains a ghost, an elusive figure, who terrorized a community and then vanished without a trace. What makes this case so haunting isn't just the young age of the victims or the brutality of their deaths. It's the calculated precision behind every act. This wasn't random violence, it was organized, cold, and deeply intentional. The victims weren't just abducted and killed. They were groomed, held captive, fed, washed, and posed with a disturbing level of control and care. It was as if the killer viewed murder as a ritual, a dark performance of domination and manipulation. Even now, the families left behind continue to fight for justice. Mark Stebbins would be a man in his late 50s today. Jill Robinson might be a grandmother. Christine Mihalik could have grown up to become a teacher or a nurse. Timothy King had the potential to become anything he dreamed of, but instead, their lives were frozen in time, forever remembered as innocent children stolen by a monster who was never brought to justice. The Oakland County child killer may be dead now, taking his secrets to the grave, or perhaps he is still out there, hidden in plain sight, his identity forever buried beneath decades of fear, silence, and heartbreak. He could be in an unmarked grave by now, or perhaps still alive, an elderly man living unnoticed in some quiet suburban street, his dark history hidden beneath decades of seeming normalcy. The reality is, we may never have the full answer, but what is certain is that somewhere, a murderer managed to pull off the perfect crime not once, but for separate times. That is what makes the Oakland County child killer one of the most chilling predators in American history, not simply because of the horror he inflicted, but because he was never brought to justice. Because for families were denied the closure they desperately needed. Now, we turn our attention to Walter Ellis. What makes Ellis so profoundly unsettling isn't only the viciousness of his acts, but how he was able to kill over a span of 21 years while appearing to lead an ordinary existence. He held steady jobs, raised a family, and blended into the community. He was the unassuming neighbor next door, the coworker you'd share casual conversation with during lunch, the man who seemed entirely unremarkable. Yet behind this mask of normal life hid a serial killer whose spree would claim at least 7 known victims, though authorities suspect the actual number was far higher. Walter Ellis was born in 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, into a household that would help forge his warped perspective. His early years were marked by chaos and violence. His mother battled mental illness and addiction, often disappearing for days, leaving Walter and his siblings to survive on their own. His father was mostly absent, a shadow drifting in and out of their lives, and when he did show up, he brought turbulence, domestic abuse, and a stream of criminal acquaintances who treated the Ellis home as a temporary refuge. By adolescence, Walter was already demonstrating the traits that foreshadowed his later crimes. He was caught spying through windows, trailing women as they walked home, and intimidating female classmates. These incidents weren't random adolescent mischief. They were deliberate practice runs for something much darker. Walter was learning to stalk, observing his targets, memorizing their habits, and identifying their weaknesses. In 1981, when he was 21, Ellis committed his first confirmed murder. The victim, Deborah Harris, was a 23-year-old factory worker. She was discovered strangled in her apartment, her body deliberately arranged in a way that suggested the killer had lingered with her remains. Evidence pointed to sexual assault, but what most disturbed detectives was the meticulous staging of the scene. Nothing appeared to be taken, there was no forced entry, and aside from the victim herself, the apartment was unnervingly orderly. The investigation quickly stalled. Deborah had no known adversaries, no bitter ex-partners, no obvious reason anyone would want her dead. Detectives combed the area, interviewed her contacts, and pursued every plausible lead. But Walter Ellis never became a suspect. He was just another ordinary figure in the background, a name buried in witness interviews, easily overlooked and forgotten. What law enforcement didn't grasp was that they were confronting someone with a remarkable capacity to vanish in plain sight. Walter wasn't the stereotypical outcast lurking alone in alleys. He could be personable when necessary, considerate to neighbors, and adept at sensing what people expected him to be and then presenting exactly that. He worked various blue-collar jobs: bartender, construction laborer, maintenance worker, that granted him access to buildings and opportunities to observe possible victims without drawing attention. After the Harris killing, Ellis appeared to go dormant for several years, not because he'd suppressed his violent impulses, but because he was studying his mistakes and honing his approach. He read extensively about investigative techniques, familiarized himself with law enforcement protocols, and most importantly, learned to select victims who would not be immediately missed. He soon focused on sex workers, women battling addiction, and those living at society's edges, people who could vanish for weeks without prompting alarm. By 1986, he was ready to kill again. Walter struck again. This time, his victim was Sheila Ferrier, a 19-year-old mother of two who sometimes engaged in sex work to support her children. Her body was found in an abandoned building on Milwaukee's North Side, posed with the same disturbing care that investigators had seen in Deborah Harris's murder. But now, Walter had become even more meticulous. He had thoroughly cleaned the scene, eliminated potential evidence, and selected a place where the body might remain undiscovered for days. Over the next 15 years, this pattern continued. Walter Ellis killed at least 5 more women, all following the same method. He would approach them on the street, either pretending to be a client or simply acting like a helpful stranger. He was exceptionally skilled at recognizing women who were isolated, desperate, or vulnerable. Once he earned their trust, he led them to a secluded location where he strangled them with his bare hands. What made Walter especially dangerous was his patience. He could go for months or even years without killing, living an apparently ordinary life in between. During these stretches, he held steady jobs, maintained relationships, and even cared for his elderly mother. People who knew him described him as quiet and reliable, the sort of man who would help you carry groceries or lend you $20 if you needed it. No one suspected that this mild-mannered neighbor was a predator systematically murdering women across Milwaukee. The case finally broke open not because of any brilliant deduction, but thanks to progress in DNA technology. In 2009, nearly 3 decades after his first known crime, investigators were able to extract DNA from the old crime scenes and run it through modern databases. The results definitively linked all 7 murders to one man, confirming long-held suspicions that a serial killer had been operating undetected for decades. Even more disturbing was the realization that Walter Ellis had been in the system the entire time. He had been arrested numerous times over the years for minor infractions, domestic disputes, disorderly conduct, public intoxication, but never for anything serious enough to keep him off the streets. Again and again, he slipped through the cracks, avoiding prison time that might have ended his crimes. When authorities finally arrested him in 2009, his neighbors and coworkers were genuinely shocked. He wasn't an isolated loner or someone with a threatening presence. He was simply Walter, the man who would shovel snow for elderly neighbors and share a joke in passing. The gap between his outward normalcy and the horror he concealed was almost impossible to comprehend. During interrogation, he initially denied all involvement. But once confronted with the undeniable DNA evidence, his composure began to unravel. Investigators were struck by how completely he had compartmentalized his life. He spoke about the murders with a flat detachment, like he was describing events he had merely witnessed rather than committed himself. He referred to his victims as objects that served a purpose, showing no remorse or understanding of the devastation he had caused. To him, ending their lives was simply an unfortunate necessity to get what he wanted. The coldness of his confession was more chilling than any outburst or emotional breakdown could have been. The investigation revealed that Walter's crimes had a consistent pattern, but not one that made him easier to catch. Unlike many serial killers who escalate over time, he maintained a steady, methodical pace, striking only when the urge resurfaced. Walter struck whenever the urge returned and whenever he encountered a victim who seemed suitably vulnerable. but he never allowed his impulses to override his caution. It was this discipline that enabled him to evade capture for more than 20 years. Perhaps the most unsettling realization was that Walter Ellis had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. He lived in the same neighborhoods as some of the women he killed, shopped in the same stores, and even attended some of the same community gatherings. He was a master at camouflage, projecting an image of harmless ordinariness while harboring thoughts and desires that most people would find unimaginable. For the families of his victims, there was a particular torment in knowing their loved ones hadn't been taken by some obvious monster, but by a man who looked like anyone else. There were no clear warning signs that might have saved their daughters, sisters, and mothers. When Walter Ellis was finally convicted, he received 7 consecutive life sentences without any chance of parole. He died in prison in 2013, carrying with him whatever secrets remained about additional crimes he likely committed. Investigators believe there are probably more victims women whose deaths were never connected to the Milwaukee North Side Strangler because the killings were so carefully concealed or because their remains were never recovered. The case of Walter Ellis stands as a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself in obvious ways. Sometimes it wears a friendly face, keeps steady employment, and helps elderly neighbors with their groceries. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who understand that the safest place to hide is in the middle of everyday life among unsuspecting people. His story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of evil. We want to believe that monsters are easy to recognize, that their darkness shows on the outside, making it possible for us to protect ourselves. But Walter Ellis proved that the greatest danger often comes from those who have perfected the art of appearing harmless, unremarkable, and easily forgotten. For 21 years, Walter walked among his neighbors, co-workers, and community members, carrying within him a darkness that ultimately claimed at least 7 lives. He paid his bills, bought groceries, made small talk about the weather, all while planning his next killing. The next killer whose story demands our attention is a man whose name still sends a chill through the Pacific Northwest, a predator who terrorized communities across multiple states while hiding behind a facade of politeness and respectability. His crimes were so calculated and savage that even seasoned investigators struggled to understand the depths of his depravity. This is the story of Jake Bird, a drifter who left a trail of blood across America for more than 4 decades, and whose final words would haunt everyone who heard them. Jake Bird was born in 1901 in Louisiana, though much about his early life remains shrouded in mystery. What is known is that by his teenage years, he had already begun the transient lifestyle that would define his spree of violence. He rode freight trains from town to town, staying only long enough to find temporary work, watch potential victims, and then vanished before anyone could connect him to the horrors left behind. Bird had a talent for fitting in. He was soft-spoken and polite, with an almost disarming demeanor that made people instinctively trust him. He would show up at farms looking for odd jobs or repairs, anything that gave him an excuse to get close to families. But behind those quiet eyes was a predator who had refined the art of murder. His weapon of choice was an axe, not a gun or a knife, but something far more personal and brutal. When Bird struck, he often did so in the dead of night, slipping through darkened houses like a ghost. By morning, entire families would be found slaughtered in their beds. The first confirmed murder tied to him took place in 1930, though investigators believe he had been killing long before then. A family in Illinois was found hacked to death in their farmhouse. The crime seemed so gruesome that even veteran officers were physically sick. There was no sign of robbery or any motive beyond the twisted satisfaction Bird seemed to take from ending lives. What made Bird especially terrifying was his mobility. This was the 1930s and 1940s, decades before modern communication systems or national databases could track a killer across state lines. He exploited this perfectly. After committing a murder, he would hop a freight train and be hundreds of miles away before the victims were even discovered. By the time local authorities began piecing together what had happened, Bird was already searching for his next target. His killings stretched from Louisiana to Washington, from Texas to Oregon. He targeted rural families in isolated farmhouses, where no one would hear the screams and where bodies could lie undiscovered for days. He seemed to have an instinct for vulnerability, choosing victims who were alone and defenseless. In 1942, Bird struck in Nebraska. The Morrison family parents and their two young children were found dead in their kitchen, killed with clinical precision. After the murders, Bird ransacked the house, but took only a little food and a few dollars, proving yet again that robbery was never his true motive. It was about the kill. The pattern repeated itself in state after state. A family in Colorado, another in New Mexico, then Oregon. Each crime scene bore his distinctive signature: the axe wounds, the careful arrangement of the bodies, the minimal theft. But without modern forensic tools and interstate communication, connecting those dots was nearly impossible. Without modern forensic tools or the ability to share information quickly between states, each of Jake Bird's murders was treated as a separate incident. No one realized they were facing a serial killer who had spent decades perfecting his craft. Bird's eventual capture came 1947 in Tacoma, Washington. That night, he broke into the home of Bertha Cludd and her daughter Beverly, planning yet another attack. But this time, his plan unraveled. Beverly fought back, screaming loud enough to wake neighbors. Although Bird managed to kill both women with his axe, the noise brought immediate attention. For the first time, witnesses saw him running away. Police arrested Bird just a few blocks from the house, still carrying the blood-covered axe. When they took him into custody, he was strangely calm and almost seemed relieved. He didn't struggle or attempt to flee. During interrogation, Bird began confessing, but he didn't offer excuses or apologies. Instead, he recited a long, matter-of-fact list of murders spanning 17 years and multiple states. The scale of his admissions was staggering. Bird claimed he had killed 44 people, though investigators suspected the true number was higher. He described each killing with a cold, unsettling detachment, recalling families he had wiped out as if he were listing errands. He gave specific details that only the killer could know, facts investigators had never made public. In Kansas, he said he murdered a family of 5, including 3 young children. In Texas, he recounted killing an elderly couple, then staying in their home for 3 days, eating their food and sleeping in their bed while their bodies decomposed just a few feet away. Perhaps the most chilling part of Bird's confessions was his total absence of remorse. He didn't blame mental illness or a difficult upbringing. He simply admitted that he enjoyed killing. It made him feel powerful and in control in a way nothing else could. The trial quickly became a national spectacle. Jake Bird had eluded authorities for nearly 20 years, leaving behind a trail of violence that stretched across the country. The evidence was overwhelming, not only for the Tacoma murders, but for numerous other crimes. But Bird had one final, bizarre act. At sentencing, he pointed at the judge, the prosecutor, and several court officials. In a voice that witnesses described as eerie and unnatural, he declared, "I'm putting the Jake Bird hex on all of you who had anything to do with my being punished." What happened next was difficult to explain. Within a year, 6 of the people Bird had singled out were dead. The judge died of a heart attack. The prosecutor was killed in a car crash. A court reporter suffered a sudden stroke. A police officer who helped arrest Bird died in his sleep. The deaths were so numerous and so strangely timed that even the most skeptical observers began to wonder if Bird had carried some dark force with him. Jake Bird was executed on July 15, 1949, yet the so-called Jake Bird hex seemed to linger. In the years that followed, more people connected to the case died unexpectedly or under unusual circumstances. Whether the curse was real or just coincidence, the story became part of Pacific Northwest legend, a reminder that some killers leave behind more than just physical victims. The true horror of Jake Bird was not only the shocking number of lives he took, it was his ability to remain invisible for so long. He was the polite drifter who offered to chop wood, the soft-spoken stranger who asked for directions, the helpful man who promised to repair a fence. And when night came, he turned into something entirely different. Bird's story exposed how vulnerable law enforcement was in the 1930s and 1940s without national crime databases, reliable forensic science, or real-time communication. Men like Jake Bird could slip from state to state, killing with impunity and vanishing before anyone even realized a pattern existed. Back then, a killer could simply hop on a train and disappear, without a trace, leaving behind only heartbreak and unanswered questions. It's chilling to imagine how many other predators like Jake Bird were moving through the shadows, committing murders and vanishing like ghosts. Even today, investigators still examine Bird's case. They pore over unsolved murders from that era, searching for patterns that might finally reveal the true extent of his crimes. Some experts believe he may have killed more than 60 people, which would make him among the most prolific serial murderers in American history. Others suspect the real number could be even higher. Jake Bird died with most of his secrets intact. He took with him the final count of his victims, the hidden burial sites no one ever found, and the answers that might have brought peace to grieving families who spent decades wondering what happened. Now we come to Clifford Olson, and if you think the killers we've discussed so far were monstrous, Olson's story takes things to an even darker place. He wasn't just a predator. He was a man who turned the murder of children into a grotesque business deal, literally selling the locations of his victims' bodies back to desperate families who were frantically searching for any trace of their children. In the summer of 1981, British Columbia was engulfed in fear. Children began disappearing in disturbing numbers, not just one or two isolated cases, but dozens. Some vanished while walking home from school. Others were last seen hitchhiking or simply playing near their neighborhoods. They were young boys and girls who seemed to evaporate into thin air. The newspapers called it a summer of terror, but that label barely hinted at the horror unfolding behind the headlines. At the center of it was Clifford Robert Olson, a career criminal who had discovered something that thrilled him more than any robbery or con ever could: the cold-blooded abduction, torture, and murder of children. Olson was born in 1940 in Vancouver, and almost from the beginning, it was clear that something about him was deeply disturbed. As a young child, he was violent, cunning, and completely lacking empathy. By age 12, he was already breaking into houses not just to steal valuables, but to destroy whatever he could. He would tear through drawers, rip up family photographs, and scrawl obscene messages across the walls. When he was caught, he didn't look ashamed or embarrassed. He smiled with genuine satisfaction at the chaos he had caused. What followed over the next 8 months was not a series of random killings, but a cold, calculated campaign of terror. Olson didn't strike impulsively. He hunted, he observed. His victims learned their habits and patiently waited for the precise moment when they were most vulnerable. 9-year-old Simon Partington was abducted on his way to school. 13-year-old Ada Court vanished while cycling through her neighborhood. 18-year-old Sandra Wolfsteiner disappeared after accepting a ride to what she believed was a job interview. But the horror didn't end with their abductions. Olson later confessed that some victims were kept alive for days. He would shuttle them between abandoned buildings, isolated cabins, and hidden underground spaces, locations where no one could hear their cries for help. What took place in those places defies description. He subjected them to unimaginable torment, using each victim as a test subject in his twisted experiments with cruelty. He treated murder like an art form, refining his process, evolving his tactics, becoming more monstrous with every passing day. The effect on the community was devastating. Fear replaced routine. Parents no longer allowed their children to walk alone. Schools tightened security, playgrounds empty. Normal life disintegrated under the weight of collective panic and grief. And Olson? He watched it all unfold with smug satisfaction. He admitted later that he took nearly as much pleasure from watching terrified families and tearful news reports as he did from committing the crimes themselves. Police were helpless. There were no reliable witnesses, no fingerprints, no clear pattern to follow. Olson operated across different regions, switching his hunting grounds to avoid detection. He was precise, patient, and disturbingly lucky on several occasions. He was even stopped by police for minor traffic violations while transporting his victims. But his charm and quick wit bought him freedom. Ironically, it wasn't brilliant investigative work that ended Olson's reign of terror, it was his own arrogance. In July 1981, he was caught attempting to abduct two young girls. They escaped and gave authorities a detailed description of his car. He was arrested, but at that point, the evidence was still thin, certainly not enough for multiple murder charges. That's when Olson made a shocking offer, one that stunned the entire nation. He told investigators he would reveal the burial locations of his victims. For a price, $10,000 for each body, $10,000 per child. The proposition horrified officials. Paying a serial killer for information seemed morally indefensible, but parents were desperate. They had spent months searching, clinging to fading hope, tormented by not knowing. For them, closure, no matter how costly, was worth everything. After intense debate, the deal was made. Olson led police to the graves of 11 victims, collecting $110,000 in total. Each discovery was more horrifying than the last. Some children had endured prolonged suffering. Others had been mutilated even after death. The youngest was only 9 years old, and through it all, Olson remained detached. He guided officers to each grave site with the casual demeanor of someone pointing out directions on a map. He joked, he complained about the weather. There wasn't the faintest flicker of remorse. The details of his confessions were so gruesome, so deeply disturbing, that many were never made public. He spoke about his crimes with clinical detachment, outlining methods, motivations, and how he had stayed ahead of the law. It was as if he took pride in the depravity, eager to be recognized for his precision and planning. Even the investigators, experienced, hardened professionals who had seen humanity at its worst, were shaken. The details shared during Clifford Olson's trial were so horrifying that many felt physically ill just listening. Olson ultimately admitted to 11 counts of first-degree murder, accepting 11 concurrent life sentences in return. Under Canadian law at the time, that meant he could apply for parole after just 25 years, a fact that outraged the entire nation and sparked urgent reforms in Canada's legal approach to multiple homicides. Yet for Olson, it was all just a game. In prison, he continued his twisted behavior, filing absurd lawsuits, sending bizarre letters to the press, and cruelly tormenting the families of his victims with parole requests he knew would never be granted. In various interviews, he hinted that the true number of his victims far exceeded the official count. He claimed responsibility for murders in other provinces, even other countries, and spoke of runaways and street children whose disappearances had never even been investigated. But he would only share these details if someone paid, turning his confessions into one more form of psychological torture for those already devastated. What made Olson especially disturbing wasn't just his cruelty, it was his utter lack of humanity. Most serial killers, even the most monstrous, occasionally reveal some flicker of remorse. Olson showed none. He was emotionally hollow, a man-shaped predator who operated on a moral code completely alien to normal human beings. He spent over 30 years in prison, never once expressing genuine regret. He offered no answers to the grieving families unless money was involved. He never acknowledged the humanity of the people he had destroyed. When he died in 2011 at the age of 71, he took with him secrets that will never be uncovered, and identified victims, undisclosed burial sites. His case left a permanent scar on Canada. It exposed terrifying flaws in the justice system and forced the country to confront a dark truth: that some people are not redeemable. Some crimes are so unspeakable that they shake our faith in human nature itself. Perhaps most chilling of all, Olson showed that even in our most desperate moments, when we seek closure, there are those who will exploit our pain for their own grotesque pleasure. Meanwhile, the case of William Suff is no less haunting. He led a chilling double life. By day, he worked quietly and efficiently at the Riverside County Health Department, processing documents and maintaining a low profile. Colleagues described him as punctual, courteous, and competent. But by night, he transformed into something else. A predator stalking the streets of Riverside, California, between 1986 and 1991, Suff murdered at least 13 women, most of them sex workers struggling with addiction. What made him especially terrifying was how perfectly he concealed his true nature. He wasn't some disheveled loner lurking in shadows. He was a government employee, a man with a routine, a paycheck, and an unremarkable appearance that allowed him to vanish into crowds unnoticed. He even understood the criminal justice system from the inside, using his knowledge of administrative processes to stay ahead of the investigators trying to catch him. Born in 1950 in New York, Suff moved to California as a child. His early life seemed ordinary, but those close to him later recalled troubling signs: emotional distance, an obsession with control, and difficulty forming relationships. As a teen, he was arrested for minor offenses, nothing that predicted the horrors to come. In 1974, while living in Texas with his wife and baby daughter, Suff committed his first known murder, killing his 2-month-old daughter in a violent outburst. His wife, also attacked, barely survived. Though convicted and sentenced to 70 years, a technicality led to his release in 1980 after just a decade behind bars. Instead of choosing rehabilitation or escalation, Suff opted for invisibility. He relocated to Riverside, secured a stable job, and blended into the community. To neighbors and coworkers, he was just another man trying to start over. But behind closed doors, he was sharpening his methods. The murders began 2 years after his release, targeting women on the fringes of society, those most likely to vanish without immediate notice. It took investigators years to connect the crimes, by which time the damage was devastating. When the victims' bodies were eventually discovered, often dumped in desolate, remote spots around Riverside County, their deaths were first seen as individual tragedies. Police assumed they were outcomes of street violence, drug deals gone wrong, disputes between pimps and sex workers, or the grim consequences of life on society's margins. But as the number of victims increased, disturbing patterns began to surface, patterns too precise to ignore. The killer had his signature. Every woman had been strangled, but not quickly. These weren't impulsive acts, they were slow, methodical killings designed to prolong the suffering. After death, many of the bodies had been mutilated in eerily specific ways. In several cases, the victims' breasts were removed with an almost clinical precision. Jewelry and clothing items that clearly held emotional significance were missing, likely taken as trophies. Even more horrifying, some victims bore signs of torture inflicted while they were still alive: burns from cigarettes, cuts made with blades, clear evidence of prolonged captivity and unimaginable pain. This wasn't random violence. This was methodical, ritualized torture carried out by someone with time, privacy, and a chilling commitment to their own sadistic fantasies. What made the investigation so complex was William Suff's intelligence and his intimate understanding of how law enforcement worked. He knew that cases involving sex workers and addicts rarely received the attention that middle-class victims would. He deliberately targeted women who existed outside the safety nets of society, who wouldn't be missed right away, and whose cases would not trigger rapid or thorough investigations. He carefully avoided leaving a trail. His dumping sites were never consistent, geographically scattered, so no clear pattern could be traced back to him. He wore gloves, cleaned up after himself, and avoided the usual slip-ups that expose most serial killers. But like many criminals who operate unchecked for years, Suff's arrogance eventually became his weakness. Over time, he began to take bolder risks. He hunted closer to his own neighborhood. He stopped just collecting jewelry. He began keeping personal keepsakes, even photographs, and stored them in his apartment like grotesque trophies from a private museum. Worst of all, he began inserting himself into the investigation, showing up at crime scenes, pretending to be a bystander, and even phoning in anonymous tips to the police hotline set up to catch him. The breakthrough came in 1991, when law enforcement finally accepted what many already feared: they were dealing with a serial killer. A multi-jurisdictional task force was created, uniting detectives from several departments who had all been working eerily similar cases. When the data was pulled together, the picture became clearer. The killer was calculating, well-organized, and familiar with the local terrain. He was also becoming more frequent in his attacks and more violent. Detectives focused their attention on men who lived or worked near the areas where the bodies had been found. Thousands of interviews were conducted, backgrounds checked, and alibis scrutinized. William Suff's name surfaced early due to his past conviction, but he was quickly dismissed as a likely suspect. His co-workers at the county office vouched for him, describing him as a changed man, punctual, polite, and focused on his job. His apartment was clean, his lifestyle ordinary, and he had no obvious link to the victims. But one investigator, Sergeant Kristen Kears, wasn't convinced. Something about Suff's demeanor during questioning felt off. He was too composed, too eager to help, and oddly enthusiastic about sharing information. Kears decided to take a closer look, launching her own quiet investigation. She tracked his movements, observed his behavior, and began building a profile. What she uncovered was chilling. William Suff was living a life of absolute compartmentalization. By day, he was the ideal civil servant, disciplined, punctual, and invisible, but by night, he became something else entirely. By day, William Suff maintained the image of a quiet, dependable public servant. But when night fell, his true self emerged. He often spent hours cruising through the very neighborhoods where his victims were later found. He frequented bars, truck stops, and known red light districts, places where vulnerable women, many battling addiction, could be approached without raising suspicion. On more than one occasion, he was seen speaking with women who would later vanish, women who perfectly matched the profile of his known victims. For a long time, the case against Suff remained frustratingly circumstantial. That changed when investigators finally secured a warrant to search his apartment. What they discovered shocked even the most hardened officers. Inside, they found a nightmare. Suff had kept meticulous records of his crimes. Photographs of victims, some alive, others post-mortem, were arranged throughout his bedroom with disturbing precision. Trophies were everywhere: jewelry, clothing, and even preserved body parts stored in jars. His living space had become a shrine to murder. Every item, every image, was placed with obsessive care, as if cataloging a grotesque collection. Most horrifying of all were the handwritten journals, pages upon pages of detailed murder accounts that read less like confessions and more like instructional manuals. He described his techniques, his preparations, and the ways he prolonged suffering. The level of detail, the clinical tone, and the pride embedded in his writing left investigators stunned and sickened. During his interrogation, Suff remained cold and composed. He didn't deny what he had done. He described it proudly, correcting investigators on small details, speaking about murder the way a craftsman might speak about their trade. He showed no remorse, no shame, only a desire to control the narrative. The trial that followed became a national sensation. But to Suff, it was a stage. He insisted on representing himself during parts of the proceedings, cross-examining witnesses, presenting evidence, and engaging with the court in the same methodical, emotionless manner he had used to commit his crimes. He showed no reaction when photos of his victims were shown, no expression when grieving families delivered victim impact statements. To him, the trial was just another puzzle to solve, another opportunity to prove his intellectual dominance. Ultimately, William Suff was convicted of 12 murders and sentenced to death. As he was led out of the courtroom, he smiled and waved to the spectators like an actor acknowledging applause. He currently remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he has spent over 30 years filing appeals, writing to journalists, and proclaiming his innocence. Despite overwhelming physical and testimonial evidence, he continues to blame his victims for their own deaths. The case reshaped how law enforcement views crimes involving marginalized women. The delays in recognizing a serial killer were a painful lesson in the consequences of dismissing such victims as unimportant. Law enforcement agencies implemented new protocols to improve data sharing across jurisdictions and committed more resources to protecting vulnerable populations. But perhaps the most unsettling lesson from the William Suff case is just how easily he disappeared into society. This was not a shadowy drifter or a madman screaming on street corners. This was a man who had already killed before a man capable of extreme violence who walked out of prison, found work in a government office, and began killing again. His job gave him access to law enforcement systems. His clean-cut appearance helped him win trust. His knowledge of red tape and procedure allowed him to avoid scrutiny. Even now, the families of his victims are haunted by unanswered questions. How many women did he truly kill? How many bodies were never recovered? How often did he narrowly escape capture? And most haunting of all, how many others like him are out there today? These 5 chilling cases dismantle a common myth that serial killers are easily spotted, wild-eyed, unstable, and visibly dangerous. In reality, many blend in perfectly, hiding behind ordinary lives and normal routines. And that's what makes them truly terrifying. Many of these predators weren't deranged loners lurking in shadows. They were neighbors, co-workers, the quiet man who smiled politely, mowed his lawn, and never caused a problem. What they all understood better than anyone was that the most effective place to hide is often in plain sight, and they used that knowledge with devastating precision. The Oakland County child killer operated with such calculated precision and access to resources that investigators suspected ties to organized crime or even law enforcement. Walter Ellis lived in Milwaukee for over 2 decades, killing women while blending seamlessly into his community. Jake Bird crisscrossed the country, leaving behind a trail of bodies while posing as a harmless drifter. Clifford Olson exploited grieving families and manipulated the legal system for personal gain. And William Suff used his position in a government office to mask a 5-year killing spree. What connects these men isn't just the brutality of their crimes, it's their ability to exploit the gaps in our justice systems and the blind spots in our society. They knew who society ignored. They knew which victims wouldn't be missed immediately, which cases wouldn't make headlines, and which crimes would be labeled just another tragedy instead of a pattern worth investigating. The case of William Suff forces us to confront an even more unsettling reality. Some killers don't just hide behind normalcy, they weaponize it. They turn their seemingly ordinary lives into camouflage, using trust, routine, and familiarity as tools to disarm their victims and deceive authorities. What makes these cases so deeply disturbing isn't only the acts themselves, it's what they reveal about the systems we rely on for safety. Every one of these men, Olson, Suff, Bird, Ellis, and the still unknown Oakland County child killer, understood something chillingly simple. We want evil to be obvious. We want monsters to look like monsters, but the truth is far more terrifying. Evil often wears the face of the man next door, the helpful clerk, the friendly neighbor who keeps to himself. The Oakland County child killer embodied this reality. For over a year, this predator moved silently through suburban Detroit, selecting victims with terrifying precision. But what's most disturbing isn't just that they were never caught, it's how carefully the crimes were executed. Each child was held for days, treated with twisted kindness, given favorite meals only to be murdered with chilling calculation. The killer knew that this mix of cruelty and care would confuse authorities. It wasn't just physical manipulation, it was psychological warfare. This individual anticipated every investigative move, leaving behind just enough evidence to taunt police, but never enough to be captured. In an era when parents were teaching their children about stranger danger, this predator hid behind the very fear that created becoming invisible in a neighborhood full of suspicion. Walter Ellis took this deception even further. For 21 years, he didn't just hide within the community, he became part of it. He was no passing stranger, he was a fixture. He attended block parties, helped elderly neighbors carry groceries, kept his yard tidy. People described him as polite, dependable, helpful. That wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. Ellis weaponized trust. He lived a compartmentalized existence by day. He was Walter the handyman, the good neighbor. But once night fell, he became someone else entirely. He prowled the same streets where he was welcomed during the day, and when his victims saw him approaching, they likely felt a sense of ease. He was familiar, a local, not a threat, but he was the threat. He was a familiar face in the neighborhood, a man people recognized, and that recognition bred trust. And trust in the hands of a predator becomes a powerful weapon. Walter Ellis wasn't simply living a double life. He lived multiple lives, each one carefully designed, deliberately maintained. The helpful neighbor wasn't just a mask, he became that identity. This wasn't a case of split personality, this was something far more calculated, a predator, fully aware of every role he played and how each one served his darker purpose. Jake Bird represented yet another evolution in this chilling intelligence. He grasped something that many criminals never realized: geography could be his greatest advantage. Long before the days of centralized databases or real-time communication between states, Bird turned America's vastness into his camouflage. He didn't just move between cities, he moved between identities, between social roles, even between entire ways of being. His brilliance, if that's what we dare call it, was in recognizing that each community had its own blind spots. In rural towns, he posed as a laborer seeking work. In big cities, he was just another drifter, unremarkable and easily forgotten. In every new place, he observed first. He learned who was vulnerable, who wouldn't be missed, and who law enforcement would never suspect. Bird didn't just blend in, he became invisible. He adjusted his behavior to fit his surroundings like a social chameleon. But what's most disturbing about Bird isn't how many people he killed, it's how effectively he did so. He had a system. He evaluated victims and escape routes before ever committing a crime. And when he left no trace, not even memories. In some towns, residents only learned he'd been there years later, when he confessed to murders they never knew had happened. Then there's Clifford Olson, perhaps the most psychologically complex of them all. While others hid their crimes, Olson monetized his. He recognized a disturbing truth: information has value, and that value grows with desperation. The families of his victims were drowning in grief and uncertainty. Olson saw that uncertainty as a currency. He exploited it. He understood human psychology at its rawest when people are broken, terrified, and clinging to hope. He knew that parents would do anything, agree to anything, pay anything, just to know what happened to their children. He turned their pain into profit. Olson's manipulations went far beyond standard criminal behavior. He wasn't just trying to buy time, he was orchestrating control. He provided just enough information to keep the authorities engaged, but always withheld the one thing families needed most: closure. He created a game in which he held all the power, and he enjoyed every minute of it. These men didn't just take lives, they shattered the foundations that communities are built upon. They attacked the assumptions that make daily life feel safe, that neighbors are friendly, that quiet people are harmless, that kids are safe on their own streets, that strangers offering help are genuinely kind. What's most chilling is how these predators evolved. They learned from each crime, they adjusted. They refined their techniques. They studied their environments like anthropologists, identifying patterns, vulnerabilities, blind spots. And they understood something most people never consider: the best place to hide is in the open, not in the shadows, but in the light. Wearing the mask of normalcy, smiling, speaking softly, acting helpful, pretending to care. And that's what stays with us. That's what makes these stories so unforgettable. Because we want to believe we'd recognize danger if we saw it, that our instincts would warn us that something would feel off. But these killers succeeded not in spite of our trust, but because of it. They didn't just commit murder, they impersonated safety. They were the ones who offered to help with groceries, who waved from the front porch, who remembered your name, and asked how your day was. They weaponized trust itself. Because society runs on unspoken agreements, on invisible contracts we don't even think about. We believe that the stranger offering help has good intentions, that the person in uniform is there to protect us, that evil always looks like evil. But the truth is much darker. Evil doesn't always snarl. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it wears a badge or works in your office, or lives down the hall. And that is the most terrifying lesson these forgotten killers leave behind, that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones who lurk in the shadows, but the ones we welcome into the light. Walter Ellis knew exactly what he was doing. He understood that familiarity creates comfort and comfort breeds vulnerability. To the women in his neighborhood, he wasn't a stranger, he was a fixture, someone they'd seen before. Someone who blended into the fabric of everyday life. Jake Bird took this a step further. He knew that desperation weakens defenses, that those who are struggling are more likely to trust anyone offering work, shelter, or even just a kind word. He turned empathy into access. And once he had that access, it was already too late. But no one weaponized trust like Clifford Olson. Olson didn't just manipulate his victims. He monetized their family's grief. He turned closure into currency, selling the locations of children's bodies as if they were property listings. He knew that mourning parents would cling to even the faintest hope that their desire for answers could be turned against them, and so he played with their pain, profiting from it, dragging them through prolonged agony in exchange for fragments of truth. Then came William Suff. Suff didn't just lead a double life, he thrived in both. By day, he was a calm, competent government employee, a man whose job it was to help people navigate public systems, a taxpayer-funded worker tasked with serving the very community he was secretly destroying. By night, he hunted women most people overlooked, those struggling with addiction, poverty, or survival. He knew that his professional image made him appear harmless. He used the credibility of his job as cover, knowing full well that few would suspect the quiet, well-dressed clerk of harboring monstrous intentions. These killers weren't impulsive. They were strategic. They studied their environments like scientists, identifying weak points in society's defenses. They saw who lived on the margins, who wouldn't be missed, whose absence might not raise immediate alarm. They exploited that invisibility, but it wasn't just opportunity, they mastered camouflage. Ellis wasn't just tolerated in his community, he was welcomed. He built trust over decades. Suff was a civil servant. Olson was a manipulator of the justice system itself. These weren't shadows in the night, they were part of the daylight. And therein lies the terrifying truth. Traditional investigative methods rely on patterns, motives, and visible abnormalities. But what happens when the predator doesn't fit any pattern? What do you do when the killer's greatest weapon is being unremarkable? The Oakland County child killer was never caught. Why? Because investigators were looking for someone who looked like a predator, a loner, visibly disturbed, socially outcast. They weren't prepared for the possibility that the murderer could be someone respected, intelligent, clean, invisible. These cases show us how serial killers evolve. Ellis refined his process over decades. Bird used movement as a shield. Olson turned justice into a transaction. Suff operated with surgical precision, even gaining insight from the very systems designed to catch people like him. What's most disturbing is how well they understood the communities around them. Better often than the communities understood themselves. They knew people wanted to trust, that we instinctively assume the best, and they used that natural optimism, our humanity, as a tool. The trauma their victims' families experienced was twofold: the devastating loss of someone they loved and the horrifying realization that the person responsible may have once shaken their hand, may have stood beside them at a community event, may have smiled and said, "I'm sorry for your loss." That's why these stories matter. They force us to confront truths we'd rather avoid, that evil doesn't always announce itself, that Danger isn't always loud or chaotic. Sometimes it's patient, polite, well-dressed, helpful. These killers weren't just taking lives, they were dismantling the very assumptions that keep society functioning. They prove that the monsters we fear aren't always the ones hiding in the shadows, they're often the ones who seem the most ordinary. And that's what makes them unforgettable, because they didn't just commit unspeakable acts, they did so without raising suspicion. They operated undetected for years, and the real horror is how easy it was for them to do it. They understood something most of us don't want to accept, that our greatest strength as a society, our trust in each other, is also our greatest weakness. We trust because we have to. It's what holds communities together, but trust in the wrong hands becomes a weapon, and that is the most chilling lesson these forgotten killers leave behind. The pattern never changed. William Suff would patrol the streets of Riverside County in his county-issued delivery van, a vehicle that gave him the perfect cover. To any passerby, he was just another employee doing his rounds. But behind the wheel, he was cold, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When he spotted someone who fit his pattern, he didn't act immediately. He'd circle back, sometimes tailing them for hours. His method wasn't brute force, it was manipulation. He positioned himself as a rescuer, a friendly stranger offering help to women in desperate situations. He gave them just enough reason to trust him, and many did. They stepped into his van willingly, believing they were escaping danger. What they didn't know was that they were stepping into a chamber built for torture. Suff had modified the inside of his van to serve one purpose: control. The windows were tinted, the rear compartment was insulated for sound, and it was stocked with restraints, tools, and cleaning supplies. He had prepared for every possible scenario. Once the doors shut, the nightmare began. He didn't kill immediately. His methods were slow, calculated, and designed to inflict prolonged suffering. Victims were bound, assaulted, and subjected to unimaginable torment. He inflicted wounds that maximized pain while deliberately avoiding death, at least at first. Some women were kept alive for hours, enduring a horror few could imagine. But even when death came, Suff's depravity didn't end. He violated the bodies after death. He posed them, photographed them, and mutilated them. He removed body parts as keepsakes, his own twisted souvenirs. This wasn't uncontrolled rage. These were acts of ritualized domination, rooted in complete dehumanization. And when he was finished, he disposed of his victims just as methodically. He had scouted out isolated locations across Riverside County, remote, but not so hidden that the bodies wouldn't eventually be found. That was part of his design. He wanted the families to know, eventually. He wanted the shock, the pain, the public discovery. It was psychological warfare, aimed at those left behind. What made catching him so difficult was the way he separated his worlds. By day, he was Bill Suff, the quiet, dependable government employee delivering furniture to county buildings. He had a wife, stepchildren, and a job. To those who knew him, he was just a man struggling with drinking and holding down steady work, not a sadistic killer. But once the house was asleep, he transformed. He knew every back alley, every forgotten lot, every part of town where vulnerable women could be found. His knowledge of the area wasn't accidental, it was studied, mapped, memorized. In the end, it wasn't police work or forensic science that cracked the case. It was a woman who fought back. She had accepted a ride, sensing something was off almost immediately. When he veered off into a remote area and his demeanor shifted, she didn't wait. She attacked, scratched, kicked. Claudine somehow managed to escape. Before disappearing into the dark, she caught one crucial detail: his license plate. When police tracked the vehicle, they were shocked. William Suff didn't fit the profile. He had no violent criminal history. His coworkers spoke highly of him. His apartment and van appeared clean at first glance. But when they looked closer, the facade crumbled. The van held fibers, traces of blood, and personal items linked to multiple victims. His garage revealed even more: photographs of women before and after their deaths, jewelry, clothing, and a chilling set of journals. In those pages, Suff documented everything: names, dates, locations, methods, even his emotional reactions, and what he wrote exposed the full extent of his darkness. He spoke of women as if they were objects. He described certain murders as successful, others as disappointing if the victim died too quickly. He ranked his victims based on how much pain he'd inflicted and how much he'd enjoyed their suffering. He experimented with different forms of torture, noting which caused the most anguish. This wasn't a man lashing out. This was someone conducting experiments, calculated, rehearsed, controlled. At trial, seasoned investigators struggled to remain composed. The brutality was one thing, but the cold, scientific detachment with which he described each act, that was something else entirely. He had turned murder into a process, into a system, into a ritual. William Suff didn't just murder, he transformed killing into a calculated and horrific routine. To him, it wasn't simply a moment of rage or impulse. It was a ritual, something methodically prepared for and carried out with disturbing anticipation. Where others might look forward to hobbies or social events, Suff looked forward to his next victim. He would plan his evenings like a hunter stalking prey, mapping out neighborhoods, watching vulnerable women, and preparing his van, the very tool of his atrocities, for his next crime. His vehicle appeared completely innocent to the public, a work van typical for a county employee. But inside, it was a mobile prison, its windows blacked out, its rear cabin soundproofed, equipped with restraints, weapons, and tools to clean up the evidence. Everything was in place, calculated and rehearsed, designed to minimize detection and maximize suffering. Suff's victims were not chosen at random. He had a specific type: women who lived on the edge of society, often struggling with addiction or surviving through sex work. He didn't see them as people, but as disposable, vulnerable targets whose disappearances would not immediately raise alarms. His method of approach was deceptively kind. He would offer them rides, a warm smile, and the illusion of safety. Many entered his van willingly, unaware they were stepping into a chamber of terror. Once inside, his demeanor would change. He became a different man: cruel, controlling, and sadistic. The suffering that followed was prolonged and horrific. Suff tortured his victims with unspeakable cruelty, deliberately keeping them alive for hours to inflict maximum pain and psychological torment. He recorded their pleas, wrote about their screams, and ranked their deaths in personal journals like they were grim trophies. Even after death, his depravity did not end. He mutilated the bodies, posed them in grotesque ways, and in some cases, committed acts of necrophilia. He took photographs of his victims, both before and after their deaths, and preserved body parts in jars. His garage resembled a macabre museum, displaying items like jewelry and clothing taken from the women he murdered. These were not just souvenirs, they were symbols of dominance, control, and perverse satisfaction. He didn't kill in bursts of madness. He executed his crimes with the patience and discipline of a man who saw murder as a craft. What made the investigation into Suff so difficult was how well he wore his mask of normalcy. By day, he was Bill Suff, the quiet, punctual employee who delivered supplies for Riverside County. He lived with his wife and stepchildren, maintained a routine, and never raised suspicions. Those around him saw a man who might be struggling with minor personal issues, but certainly not someone capable of the horror that lived inside him. His ability to compartmentalize his life was chilling. He could spend his days at work, casually chatting with coworkers, and by night, drive through deserted streets, hunting human lives with surgical precision. The breakthrough in the case came when one intended victim escaped. She had a gut feeling something was wrong after getting into his van, and when he began acting strangely, she fought back with every ounce of strength. She escaped into the night, injured but alive, and crucially, she remembered his license plate. Police traced the plate to William Suff. At first, the idea that he could be involved in a serial murder case seemed absurd to many. His record was clean, his life stable, and his public behavior unimpeachable. But when authorities searched his van and home, the nightmare became undeniable. Forensic evidence, blood, hair, and personal belongings of victims was everywhere. His journals, photographs, and collection of body parts revealed a man who wasn't just a killer, but a monster with a method. During the trial, the courtroom sat in stunned silence as the details of his crimes were revealed. Suff, however, remained stone-faced. He took notes, offered no emotion, and never expressed regret. Families of the victims delivered impact statements through tears, describing the loss and destruction he had caused. Still, he stared forward unaffected. Even when the death penalty was pronounced, he did not flinch. This lack of remorse was perhaps the most haunting part of his personality, a complete emotional void, a man without empathy. Today, William Suff resides on death row at San Quentin State Prison. He rarely speaks, does not appeal his sentence, and remains isolated from the outside world. But for the families of his victims, his continued existence is a wound that never heals, a constant reminder of the nightmare he brought into their lives. The case of William Suff is a sobering testament to the terrifying truth that evil can live next door. It can wear a smile, shake your hand, and work in your office. It doesn't always come in the form of a monster in the shadows. It often hides in plain sight, dressed in the uniform of an everyday man. These revelations aren't just stories of individual killers, they're cautionary tales for society. They show us that serial predators often study their environments like predators. In the wild, they learn the routines of law enforcement, they understand social blind spots, and they identify which victims will be missed least. Whether it's the invisible handyman like Walter Ellis, the manipulative wanderer like Jake Bird, the cold-hearted extortionist like Clifford Olson, or the state employee like Suff, they all share one thing in common: the ability to exploit society's weaknesses while blending into it seamlessly. What's most frightening is how long they operated undetected, years, sometimes decades, while leaving behind a trail of devastation. And if these men could do it, how many more like them are out there, unnoticed, waiting for their moment? He was just another government employee, driving a county van, delivering furniture to offices. At least that's how he appeared. But behind that benign exterior, William Suff was building a second life, one more horrifying than most minds can imagine. His position didn't just provide cover. It offered him mobility, trust, and insider access. With a badge of legitimacy, he could roam the streets of Riverside County without suspicion. He used his job to blend in perfectly with society, gathering information, scouting victims, and cloaking his monstrous intent in the uniform of public service. This wasn't just convenience, it was a calculated strategy by a man who understood the flaws in our systems, the cracks between institutions, and the blind spots in public vigilance. Suff was no impulsive killer. He documented his actions like a bureaucrat filing reports. Each murder was logged in journals with chilling precision: names, dates, locations, emotional reflections, and even pain rankings for each victim. It wasn't just a compulsion, it was methodology. His organized mind, honed in his day job, became a tool for orchestrating slow, deliberate violence. Suff studied his victims as if preparing for a presentation, learning their routines, isolating their vulnerabilities, and patiently waiting for the right time to strike. His cruelty was systematic, not chaotic. His van, a common delivery vehicle, was customized into a mobile prison: darkened windows, soundproofed walls, restraints, tools for torture. Women stepped into what they thought was safety, but what awaited them was prolonged torment. What connects Suff to other notorious killers like Clifford Olson, Walter Ellis, Jake Bird, and the Oakland County child killer is not just their capacity for violence, but their mastery of manipulation. Each of these men understood human psychology and social behavior with terrifying clarity. They didn't succeed in spite of society's safeguards, they thrived because they understood how to bypass them. They chose victims who lived in society's margins: sex workers, runaways, children from broken homes, people whose disappearances might not make headlines. They were normalcy like armor, knowing that trust is the most effective camouflage. These killers weren't mythical monsters hiding in shadows. They were neighbors, co-workers, quiet faces in the crowd. Ellis walked the streets of Milwaukee for 20 years, attending neighborhood cookouts while hiding the bodies of women he strangled. Jake Bird used the vast American landscape as his cover, changing identities like clothes, slipping through towns like a ghost. Olson transformed grief into profit, selling information about his child victims to desperate parents and investigators. Each of these men found a unique way to weaponize society's weaknesses, our assumptions, our blind trust, our institutional inefficiencies. Perhaps the most chilling truth is that their eventual arrests were largely accidental. Ellis was caught only because DNA technology caught up with his crimes. Olson slipped up during an unrelated investigation. Bird couldn't resist bragging. Suff's arrest stemmed from a survivor who fought back, remembered his license plate, and led police to his door. None were captured through brilliant deduction or high-tech surveillance, just luck, desperation, or a single courageous act. Which begs the question, how many like them are still out there, unnoticed? Even today, Suff sits in a cell on death row at San Quentin 3 decades after his conviction. He remains mostly silent, no appeals, no interviews, no remorse. For the families of his victims, his continued existence is a grotesque echo of a past they can't forget. His face, once unremarkable, now represents a horrifying revelation that evil can thrive not by hiding in darkness, but by disguising itself as harmless, helpful, even respectable. The stories of these killers offer more than just horror, they deliver a warning. We think we would recognize danger, that we would know a monster when we saw one. But real predators don't roar, they smile, they wave, they blend in. They exploit the systems we trust and the people we overlook. Their crimes force us to confront uncomfortable truths, that trust can be misplaced, that systems can fail, and that monsters often look just like the rest of us. These cases changed law enforcement forever. The Oakland County case forced new cooperation between jurisdictions for child abductions. Walter Ellis's crimes led to improved tracking of serial patterns. Clifford Olson's manipulation pushed reforms in how authorities engage with incarcerated informants. William Suff's reign of terror exposed the need for deeper vetting in public roles. Yet even with these lessons, the fundamental danger remains. Evil adapts, it learns. It waits. So the next time you think of a killer, don't imagine a wild-eyed lunatic. Picture the friendly neighbor, the helpful clerk, the quiet man at the end of the hall, because the most terrifying truth isn't that monsters exist, it's that they've learned how to wear the mask of normalcy better than anyone else.